The word soul is over 5,000 years old. It has survived every civilization that ever invented it. The thing the word points at, however, has been redefined at least 8 times. The Egyptian soul was not the Greek soul. The Greek soul was not the Hebrew soul. The Hebrew soul was not the Christian soul. The Christian soul was not the Cartesian soul. The Cartesian soul was not the romantic soul. The romantic soul was not the neuroscientific soul. And none of them are the algorithmic information pattern soul that almost every educated person under 40 in 2026 has unconsciously absorbed without ever explicitly choosing. By the end of this video, you will know which of the 8 definitions of soul is currently running your sense of who you are. You will know which inheritance you are carrying. And you will know what it costs you to be using a definition you never chose. Before the first definition is named, one thing has to be said clearly. The checkpoint is not here to argue for or against the existence of the soul. The checkpoint is here to inspect the 8 things the word has meant in order and what each era's redefinition was solving. The word's persistence across 5,000 years, across continents, across languages that did not borrow from each other is one of the most striking facts in the history of human language. Egyptian ka, Greek psyche, Hebrew nephesh and neshama, Sanskrit atman, Latin anima, Chinese shen, Arabic ruh, Old English sawal. The word is, in every language with continuous written history, one of the older surviving entries in the lexicon. The checkpoint will tell you what this means. Every culture has found persistently that there is a thing in human experience that requires a word distinct from body and distinct from mind. The cultures have radically disagreed about what that thing actually is. They have not disagreed that it needs a name. The modern person in 2026 has inherited the name without inheriting an agreed upon definition, which means almost everyone is using the word according to a definition they did not consciously choose, usually a mix of 2 or 3 older definitions stacked unconsciously inside the chest. Most people never notice this. Era 1, the Egyptian soul. For roughly 3,000 years, from the Old Kingdom through the Roman period, Egyptian theology held one of the most architecturally sophisticated theories of the soul ever produced. The soul was not one thing. The soul was 5 things, possibly more, depending on the dynasty. The ka, the vital essence, the life force that distinguished a living body from a corpse, inherited from the gods at birth, required offerings to sustain after death. The ba, the personality, the individual character, often depicted as a bird with a human head capable of leaving the body after death and returning. The ak, the transformed, illuminated self that the deceased would become if the funerary rites were properly completed. The ren, the name, considered an active component of the self, which had to be preserved in inscriptions or the deceased would cease to exist. The shoot, the shadow, treated as a real component of the person, separable from the body in certain ritual states. The checkpoint will tell you What was unusual about this era? The Egyptian soul was a team, not an individual. The self was a coordinated assembly of distinct functions, each of which could survive or fail to survive death independently of the others. The cargo, the first systematic theory in human history that the self was made of parts, not a unity. The cost was small. The Egyptian theory was practical, ritual, and never resolved the metaphysical question of how the parts related to each other. It worked for 3,000 years anyway. Era 2. The Greek soul. Beginning in roughly the 8th century BCE, the Greek tradition developed a single word concept that would reshape Western thought permanently: psyche. The early Greek psyche in Homer was almost a shadow, a thin breath-like residue that left the body at death and went to a dim underworld where it had little personality and less power. By Plato, in the 4th century BCE, the psyche had become something much grander. Plato argued that the psyche was the immortal, rational principle that pre-existed the body, would survive the body, and was the true seat of identity. He divided it into three parts: the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive. By Aristotle, the psyche had become the form of the body, the organizing principle that made a living thing alive. Different kinds of living things had different kinds of psyche. A plant had a nutritive psyche. An animal had a sensitive psyche. A human had a rational psyche. The checkpoint will tell you what was new in this era. For the first time, the soul was an object of philosophical argument. The soul could be reasoned about, divided into parts, hierarchically organized, and used as the foundation for ethics, politics, and education. The cargo, the soul, as the source of rationality and the highest faculty of the human person. The cost was the new dualism the Greek tradition introduced. The body was lower. The soul was higher. The body would die. The soul might not. The body's pleasures were suspect. The soul's contemplations were noble. This dualism is the inheritance most modern Western viewers carry without realizing they are carrying it. Every time you find yourself thinking that the real you is the inner thinking part and the body is somehow lesser, you are inheriting the Greek soul. Era 3, the Hebrew soul. Almost simultaneously with the Greek developments, but in an entirely different intellectual tradition, the Hebrew Bible was developing a very different conception of the soul. The Hebrew word nephesh, usually translated soul in English Bibles, does not mean what the Greek psyche meant. It means the whole living person. The breath, the body, the desires, the emotions, the throat, the appetite, the life itself. There is a related word, neshama, which means breath in a more spiritual sense, and ruach, which means wind or spirit. None of them in the original Hebrew refers to a separable, immortal, immaterial entity inside the body. The checkpoint will tell you what was unusual about this era. The Hebrew tradition refused the Greek body-soul dualism. The human being was not a soul in a body. The human being was a nephesh, a unified living person. The cargo, the first major tradition in the West to insist that the self was the whole embodied person, not a hidden interior entity. The cost was that this conception, which is the older one in the biblical text, would be largely replaced inside Judaism and Christianity itself by the time the New Testament was being written under heavy Greek influence. The checkpoint will note one thing that almost no Sunday school education mentions. The phrase, "the soul is immortal," is not a Hebrew phrase. It is a Greek phrase imported into Christian theology several centuries after the original biblical material was composed, era 4. The Christian soul. By the 2nd through 5th centuries CE, Christian theology, particularly through Augustine in the late 4th century, had fused the Hebrew tradition with the Platonic Greek tradition into a new synthesis. The Christian soul. The Christian soul was immortal, Greek inheritance. It was individual, Hebrew inheritance. It was answerable to a personal God, Hebrew inheritance. It was separable from the body at death, Greek inheritance. It had a destination, heaven, hell, purgatory, that was determined by the moral content of the life it had lived. The checkpoint will tell you what was new in this era. For the first time in human history, every individual had an eternal destiny that was determined by the contents of their own choices. The cargo, the modern self as a moral agent with infinite stakes. The cost was the invention of the Western interior in its most intense form. Every decision was now potentially eternal. Every interior thought was potentially watched. The self had been radically individualized, infinitely weighted, and placed under permanent moral surveillance. For roughly 1,500 years, the Christian soul was the dominant Western conception of selfhood. Almost every modern Western intuition about the self, that it is private, that it is interior, that it has hidden depths, that it has a moral core, is, in its DNA, a Christian inheritance. Era 5. The Cartesian soul. In 1641, the French philosopher René Descartes published the Meditations on First Philosophy, in which he attempted to find a foundation for all knowledge by doubting everything that could be doubted. He arrived at one thing he could not doubt, that something was doing the doubting. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. From this single point, Descartes built a new theory of the self. The self was a thinking thing, res cogitans, an immaterial, non-physical substance whose entire essence was thought. The body was a separate substance, res extensa, the extended thing, a kind of biological machine. The checkpoint will tell you what was new in this era. For the first time, the soul was defined entirely in terms of thinking, feeling, sensation, perception, appetite. Those were partly the bodies. The soul was the part that reasoned, the cargo, the modern intellectual self, the self as fundamentally a mind. The cost was the deepest version of body-soul dualism Western thought has ever produced. Cartesian dualism, which produced almost every later philosophical problem in modern philosophy of mind, and which still implicitly structures how most educated modern people think about themselves. Every time you say "my body" as if you owned a vehicle separate from yourself, or "my brain" as if it were a device the real you is using, you are inheriting Descartes. Era 6. the romantic soul. Beginning in the late 18th century, in reaction against the Cartesian and Enlightenment emphasis on pure reason, a new conception of the soul emerged in European thought. The romantic soul. Rousseau, Goethe, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Emerson, Whitman, each in different ways argued that the true self was not the thinking thing. The true self was the feeling thing, the deep interior, the authentic, original, individual voice that the social world tried to suppress. The romantic soul was creative. It was emotional. It was uniquely individual. It had a vocation, a calling, that the person's job was to discover and honor. The checkpoint will tell you what was new in this era. For the first time, the soul was the deep, hidden, authentic, individual self that had to be discovered, not given by tradition, not commanded by religion, not derived by reason, but excavated from the inner life by personal exploration. The cargo, the modern obsession with finding yourself. The cost was the new permanent psychological project the Romantic era assigned every individual. From now on, the failure to discover one's authentic self, one's unique gift, one's true vocation, would be experienced as a kind of secular damnation, a wasted life. Every time you say, I need to figure out who I really am, or I am trying to find my true purpose, or I want to live more authentically, you are inheriting the romantic soul. The earlier eras would not have known what you were talking about. Era 7, the neuroscientific soul. Beginning in the late 20th century, with the rise of functional brain imaging, computational neuroscience, and a more confident materialist worldview, a new conception of the soul emerged in the educated West, the neuroscientific soul. The checkpoint will say this carefully. The neuroscientific position is strictly not a redefinition of the soul. It is the claim that the word does not refer to anything that exists. The self is a pattern of neural activity. The mind is what the brain does. The feeling of being a unified self is a useful evolutionary illusion produced by the predictive processes of the cortex. The soul, as the previous 6 eras understood it, is a category error. The checkpoint will note that this position is held with varying degrees of strictness. Some neuroscientists hold it as a working assumption while remaining open. Others, like Francis Crick in The Astonishing Hypothesis, held it as a confident metaphysical claim. The cargo, the modern educated self as a complex pattern of brain activity, with no separable interior entity, no immortal destination, no metaphysical depth. The cost was substantial. The neuroscientific era inherited a culture in which 2,000 years of soul talk had shaped almost every existing word for the interior life, and then announced that the referent of those words did not exist. The result for many modern educated people was a vague, low-grade ontological vertigo. The vocabulary inherited from the older eras still felt true in moments of grief, love, awe, and ethical seriousness. The official intellectual position said it referred to nothing. The mismatch produced a new kind of modern loneliness, being unable to use the words that fit the experiences. Era 8. This is the era you are living in right now. The algorithmic soul. Here is the real issue. In the last 15 years, a new conception of the self has emerged at the intersection of computer science, philosophy of mind, and the broader cultural imagination. The algorithmic soul. The algorithmic soul is the claim, sometimes explicit, more often implicit, that what you fundamentally are is a pattern of information. The pattern could, in principle, be extracted from the biological substrate. It could be uploaded. It could be copied. It could be backed up. It could survive your body's death if the pattern were preserved. The checkpoint will tell you where this is coming from. Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is near in 2005. The growing seriousness of brain emulation research. The rapid rise of large language models that, by 2026, can convincingly simulate the linguistic personality of a deceased person from their text history. The cargo, the modern self as a transferable, copyable, potentially uploadable data structure. The cost is the most disorienting cost any of the 7 previous soul eras have produced. The algorithmic soul is philosophically the strangest of the 8. It implicitly assumes that the previous 7 were all wrong, that the self is not a 5-part Egyptian assembly, not a Greek rational principle, not a Hebrew unified embodied person, not a Christian moral agent, not a Cartesian thinking thing, not a romantic, deep, authentic individual, not a neuroscientific brain pattern, but instead an information pattern that happens to be currently running on biological hardware. The checkpoint will say it directly. Almost no modern person has consciously adopted this view. But almost every modern person under the age of 40 is already living inside it, in small ways, every day. Every time you cloud back up your photos and feel something settle in your chest, you are treating part of yourself as an information pattern. Every time you assume that you are essentially the same person you were last year, because your accounts, contacts, messages, and digital records are continuous, you are treating your identity as a data structure. Every time you imagine a future in which your AI assistant knows you well enough to act on your behalf, you are implicitly assuming that you is something that can be modeled. The 8th soul has installed itself faster than any previous soul era ever did. The 7 previous eras took centuries to spread. The algorithmic soul has spread in about 15 years, mostly without explicit announcement. The checkpoint has watched what the 8th soul is doing to the body that is supposed to host it. The body is now treating itself as the temporary biological hardware on which the real self, the information pattern, is currently running. This has consequences that almost nobody has fully metabolized. The body's signals are taken less seriously. That is just the hardware glitching. The present moment is taken less seriously. The real me is the longitudinal pattern across years of data, not whatever is happening in this 5-minute window. The face in the mirror is taken less seriously. That is just the current rendering of me. The real me is more like an account. The relationships in the room are taken less seriously because the algorithmic soul has trained the body to believe that the relationships in the feed, the ongoing data exchanges with hundreds of distant people, are also real and possibly more legible than the imperfect in-person ones. The cost of the eighth soul is the slow erasure of the here, now in this body, with this person that every previous era of soul understood in one way or another to be the actual location of the self. I lived for years inside the algorithmic soul without naming it. I thought I was being modern. I was being absent. The information pattern I was identifying with was always slightly elsewhere, in the timeline, in the archive, in the next year's plan. The body that was here was being asked to host the self that had quietly outsourced its location. The first morning, I sat in a chair for 10 minutes without consulting any account, any backup, any feed, any record, and tried to feel which soul was actually here. The answer that arrived was much smaller than the algorithmic version. It was the Hebrew nephesh, the whole embodied person, breathing in a room with no data structure required. That was the morning. The checkpoint started keeping a watch. 8 souls. The checkpoint has now inspected every one of them. Era 1, Egyptian, a team of 5. Era 2, Greek, a rational principle, hierarchically organized. Era 3, Hebrew, the whole embodied living person. Era 4, Christian, the immortal individual moral agent. Era 5, Cartesian, the thinking thing separate from the body. Era 6, romantic, the deep, authentic individual who must be discovered. Era 7, neuroscientific, a pattern of brain activity that the older language misnamed. Era 8, algorithmic, an information pattern running temporarily on biological hardware. The checkpoint will tell you something almost no philosophy, professor will say in public. Almost every modern educated adult is, without realizing it, running 3 or 4 of these definitions at once, switching between them depending on the emotional weather and never noticing the switching. In moments of grief, the Christian soul. In moments of intellectual work, the Cartesian soul. In moments of personal development talk, the romantic soul. In moments of reading neuroscience articles, the neuroscientific soul. In moments of cloud syncing the phone, the algorithmic soul. The body that is being asked to host all of them is the same body the Hebrew nephesh tradition originally pointed at. The whole embodied person, here, now, in a room, breathing. That is the body that has to host the contradiction. And the contradiction is rarely consciously inspected. Here is the practice. Every wisdom tradition would have agreed on some version of it. The checkpoint will give you the simplest one for the modern viewer. Once a day, the checkpoint suggests morning. Before the phone, sit for 5 minutes and ask one question. Which soul is currently running me? Notice which definition the body is unconsciously assuming, not which one you would intellectually endorse. Which one you are behaving from in this moment. If you are dreading a deadline as if the outcome were eternal. Christian soul. If you are treating your body as a vehicle, the real you is operating. Cartesian soul. If you are scrolling, looking for your authentic purpose. Romantic soul. If you are reassuring yourself that the dread is just neurochemistry, neuroscientific soul. If you are anxious that your data is not fully backed up because the backup feels existentially important, algorithmic soul. The checkpoint will say it carefully. The practice is not to choose one definition and force it. The practice is to notice the switching and then ask one further question. Which of the 8 definitions, if I were doing the choosing on purpose, would I want running my next decision? That is the entire practice. It takes 5 minutes. It produces something none of the 8 Erases practitioners ever had, the ability to choose consciously which inherited definition is currently shaping the body that is hosting all of them. That is the practice. The checkpoint has noticed that this identification practice is almost impossible to perform inside a phone whose other inputs are designed to keep you unconsciously oscillating between the romantic soul, the algorithmic soul, and the neuroscientific soul, without ever pausing to name which is currently in charge. Drift inward is the small, private room, the checkpoint built for exactly this kind of inspection. A place to write the soul name you are currently behaving from, separate it from the soul name you would choose, and bring the decision back into daylight where the choosing actually happens. It is not a fix. It is a single quiet page on a device whose other pages are designed to keep the inherited definitions running without your permission. The ruling. You have inherited a word, soul, that has meant 8 different things across human history. You are currently running 3 or 4 of those definitions at once, mostly without noticing. The body hosting them is the same body, the oldest tradition, correctly identified as the whole embodied person here, now, in this room. Notice which definition is currently in charge. Choose the one you would actually want running the next decision. The body has been waiting 5,000 years for the chooser to show up.